The swarm is upon us, and the Great Devourer is scarier than ever. Let's talk about the power of the Tyranids in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about the all-consuming bugs from beyond the galaxy and doing a general overview for the Tyranids army in Warhammer. In this video we'll talk about what makes the army tick, the best rules from the Codex, go through all the bio-horrors great and small, and finish up with a competitive army list idea. Currently in 40k 9th edition, the Tyranids have been having a rather good time of it. The army was kind of middling when 9th edition dropped, perhaps mainly carried by a few nice data sheets from the Imperial Armour Compendium. Then though, they got a rather nice shot in the arm for some updated rules via Synaptic Imperatives, the Hive Fleet Leviathan supplement, and the Brutal and Mighty Crusher Stampede formation, only to have all of that power then superseded by an absolutely apocalyptically powerful Tyranid Codex that crushed all before it for quite a long time. Now I do find it kind of funny that since the Codex came out, the Tyranids Codex has been hit by a massive battery of nerfs, loads of points cost increases, and a couple of important changes to key army special rules, but even despite that, they remain arguably one of the most powerful factions in Warhammer 40k. At least prior to Leagues of Votann arrival, they look like they're one of the big four factions to fear, alongside Harlequins, Sisters and Necrons. Currently in Warzone Nephilim, they're sitting on a win rate in the high 50s, along with Harlequins the best in the game, and currently they've won an awful lot of Grand Tournament wins in the season as well, I believe more so than any other army in 40k. Overall, the newsflash is that Tyranids are strong, you still need to fear them quite a lot. I feel like as factions go, Tyranids are really quite a well-rounded army at the moment. Really quite a lot of their datasheets remain very powerful despite some big points nerfs. Perhaps certain ones stand out as being extra nasty, such as the Tyranid warriors in Leviathan, the Winged Hive Tyrant with the Reaper Obliterax, and maybe Harpies, Zoanthropes and Neurothropes also being very common competitive inclusions. Hive Fleet Leviathan seems to be a real asset to the faction, a whole load of transhuman physiology type rules on big critters, and their warrior battle lines are one to fear. Aside from generally good damage and defensive profiles, they also have really quite powerful psychic too, able to hoover out a bunch of mortal wounds, and have a couple of particularly nasty psychic powers, including Catalyst and Onslaught. We'll get onto those later though. In general, for weaknesses, I'd say they don't really have all that much that really stands out. Perhaps more so than before, they do need to be a bit more careful with their units. The Winged Hive Tyrant, if it dies, will actually cause problems for the army with Synaptic Imperatives. They're certainly vastly toned down from when their codex actually dropped. Things like ridiculously cheap Maleceptor mortal wound factories are now far less auto-include, and they now no longer get to pick their adaptive trait of their Hive Fleet reactively. I'd also say that their secondaries are maybe okay but not standout. In general, they'll often be relying on the book secondaries to get their points in tournament games. Still though, not going to hurt too hard if you do manage to devour all the enemy's units off the objectives and just win on the primaries anyway. Let's go through some of the core rules of the Codex, starting out with some of the stuff that applies to a lot of datasheets, and then looking at a bunch of the rule sections in turn and talking about a few of the stronger picks. First up, synapse things are pretty common in the Codex on most of the leader bugs, and a few other useful ones, like say the Maleceptor and the Warriors. The standard synapse rule makes them a faction that rarely cares too much about leadership things. They get to auto-pass morale within 6 inches of a synapse model, though it doesn't necessarily mean that their leadership characteristics are very high for their standard units. Things that key off leadership to do damage can be quite nasty, say for example Chaos Knights or Night Lords. Synapse creatures also have Shadow in the Warp as well, an 18-inch aura of -1 to cast, and if enemies peril then they take an extra mortal wound if they do so. This one's a really nice debuff against psychic armies. It means for things like Grey Knights, Thousand Suns, and perhaps Craft Worlds as well, that's going to be an impediment to their psychic phase. If a few more powers fail over the course of the game, they could be losing a lot of utility. And finally, they have a rule called Synaptic Links. Basically, if your synapse creatures are within 12 inches of each other, they can broadcast certain buffs and psychic powers through multiple different beasties and emerge somewhere else in your army. It means that ideally you could do with keeping the synapse units somewhat near to each other, as it means that you could have, say, a unit far behind a unit of warriors, for example, but still have psychic powers manifest towards the front of the army, or be able to put a nice command phase buff such as reroll hits or something, or a different unit. I do feel that the way this feels does feel really quite fluffy for Tyranids, as one big multiple part organism with a whole load of interlocking parts. Then, as if that wasn't quite enough synapse for you, there's also the Synaptic Imperatives as well. This one's the pure army special rule for Tyranids that you basically get if you're fielding entirely the same army of Tyranids and you're not bringing along, say, any cultist Genestealer allies. The rules for this were tweaked a little bit in the balanced data slate. Basically this now means that your Warlord must be on the board, plus it means that the Hive Tyrant must be your Warlord as well. So basically this one is going to pretty much apply as long as the Hive Tyrant lives, and the buffs and extra synergy will go away if it gets killed. Kind of puts the Tyranids in a bit of an interesting prospect, because Hive Tyrants are just brutally powerful shock assault units, but it still means that you want to play at least a little bit cagey to stop them getting killed too early and denying yourself some big buffs. Otherwise, the way that this works depends on the models that you have on the army. Each battle round you activate one big buff, and things near your Synapse creatures get the benefits of these powers, but you can usually only use each one once. Perhaps out of the picks of these, I'd say the Zoanthropes one for the invul saves is really quite massive. It gives you a 4+ invul saves on monsters for a turn, and a 5+ invul on other things, say Tyranid warriors with their 4+ armor saves. This one's just awesome value, and as Zoanthropes are kind of fine as a unit in themselves, it means they're often included in just about every Tyranid list. Nice extra defense for when you're going to take a big turn of damage before you hopefully get into combat or something. Otherwise, the Neurothrope one is pretty nice, +1 to cast and deny, and a 5+ save against mortal wounds. Again, Neurothropes are fairly competitive staples for Tyranid lists. An extra big turn of Psychic is nice, and the mortal wound defense can be big against some armies, say Thousand Suns, or maybe even Tzeentch Demons. Otherwise, there's a couple of direct damage buffs. The Tyranid Warriors one is exploding 6s to hit in melee. I think just about every Tyranid list is going to get some value out of that for one turn. And there's also one for the Tyranid Prime as well, exploding 6s to hit at less than 24-inch range for your guns. Again, pretty solid. That could be buffing a whole load of warrior fire, and maybe some heavy venom cannon shots. Otherwise, I think that the Turvigons one is pretty useful as well. An extra 2-inch to your moves and advances will get you where you need to be just that little bit quicker. Quite nice for early in the game. And Hive Tyrants are going to be in just about every list, so having a turn of 4 back and charge is often going to be easy enough. Perhaps a bit more of a niche one where it's going to make a difference, and the others aren't really going to matter as much. There are others, but perhaps those ones are my favourite out of the bunch, particularly the Zoanthrope, Neurothropes, and the damage dealer ones. I think they're perhaps the most important to come up quite a bit. Finally, for the Swarms, they have a rule called Swarming Masses, maybe a slightly awkward fighting rule, which means that Swarms can still fight if they're within 2.5 inches from enemy models. It just gives you a little bit of extra freedom when you're attacking enemy units. The models can be positioned just that little bit more easily, and you might just about be able to get to fighting in 3 ranks with models with this. Though to be honest, with melee swarms not being the strongest thing in the book, to be honest, I don't really think that this rule's actually that crazy a big deal. Overall, out of these though, it means that the army generally wants to clump together around Synapse units when possible. You're almost certainly going to have a fair few of them in your army anyway, but certainly units like Tyranid warriors and things can be handy to have in the battle line. And the order that you do the synaptic imperatives is going to be pretty important. Ideally try and coincide the Zoanthrope one with a turn where you're going to take a lot of damage, and otherwise capitalise on the phases when you're going to be dealing the most damage in the psychic shooting or assault phase yourself. Moving on, let's go through a few Codex rules sections, one bit at a time, and just talk about some of the more popular picks for competitive armies. First up, we've got the Warlord traits, and I'd say the vast majority of the table is actually quite usable. Often it might be a bit of a case of picking and choosing which ones you want the most. Synaptic Tendrils is a pretty great one on a Neurothrope. It allows you to get a second use of a command phase buff. It's often used on the Neurothropes cast on 3d6 drop the lowest. That could be pretty handy to throw onto things like Hive Tyrants, Zoanthropes, or even the Maleceptor. Another really solid one is Direct Guidance. This one's a Synaptic Link command phase buff. It gives one core unit within link range a +1 to hit. Pretty much a nice direct increase to damage. Really quite nice on, say, Tyranid warriors ranked up. Adaptive Biology just makes a unit a lot tougher. 5+ feel no pain. Really quite nice on the Hive Tyrant that you're planning to throw into the fray, like the one with wings maybe. Heightened Senses is if you just want a bit more melee damage. It gives you fight first and reroll hits. Could be quite nice on the Reaper of Obliterax, or maybe things like Turvigons even. Maybe some more slow moving, heavy punch combat. Finally, Alien Cunning gives you objectives secured and he counters 5 models. It's particularly nice on the Parasite and Mortrex with its great movement, and Deathleaper also gets this one too, and again can play objective things with that. I'd say perhaps out of these, Synaptic Tendrils and Direct Guidance are probably my favourites though. Moving on, we've got Relics. Perhaps the most feared one in the Tyranids arsenal is the Reaper of Obliterax. Give this to a Hive Tyrant, probably the winged one. It still has the very fighty big bone sword damage profile, and also every successful wound roll deals a mortal wound in addition, and enemy units can't use things like feel no pains or damage caps to ignore the wounds suffered by this thing. potentially giving you a reasonable chance of chewing a fair bunch of wounds away from Abaddon the Despoiler or Catan in a single phase. A very strong weapon for a Hive Tyrant that you just want to jump in and delete everything. I'd say that one is probably the king of the combat weapons, but if you want another one, or one that's not on a Hive Tyrant, then the More Claws of Thyrax are good. You get an extra attack, reroll the wound roll, and also get the chance to gain more attacks as the game goes on. Again, that one works fine on a Hive Tyrant, maybe could give you 2 super fighty ones and not just one with the Reaper, and it's pretty nice on other things like the Trigon Prime for example. The Tyrant gun weapons also seem pretty interesting. Shard Gullet I think is maybe the best of them. That one's the Relic Heavy Venom Cannon with a big Strength 12, AP 5 and Damage 5. You're probably not going to get all that many vehicles that want to get hit by that, but I feel that both the Balethorn Cannon and Pathogenesis are both usable as gun upgrades, just maybe not quite as standout as Shard Gullets. Then to amp up on Neurothrope, the Resonance Barb is pretty usable, +1 to cast and also knows an additional power. Tyranid Psychic is good. Neurothropes can reach very silly heights of casting between this and the 3d6 drop the lowest. It can make things like psychic actions for them to stop really quite hard as well. Finally, another quite fun one is the Gestation Sac. This is the one that spawns Rippers. This one's quite a nice one for the Parasite and Mortrex as well. Gives them another way to plonk down some annoying swarms somewhere on midfield objectives, and gives the opponent yet more little annoying critters to remove if they want to take the objectives. I'd say perhaps out of these, the Reaper, Shard Gullet and the Resonance Barb though are my 3 favourites. Next up, as mentioned, Tyranid Psychic phase is really quite brutal. It's really not hard to get basically the entire discipline of this into a list with easy casts on things like Neurothropes, Hive Tyrants, and perhaps Maleceptors and Zoanthropes going around, though they might often want to focus more on mortal wounds. For value of buffing powers, both Onslaught and Catalyst seem great. Onslaught's Advance and Charge gives you a massive threat range. Catalyst's 5+ Feel No Pain is going to be worth it on just about anything that you cast it on. Both ranked up warriors or mighty Hive Tyrants will love that. If you want to double down on the mortal wounds, Neuroparasite and Psychic Scream do well. They could be quite nice ones for say a winged Hive Tyrant charging in and destroying stuff. Paroxysm is a pretty nice melee debuff. You can't overwatch and a -1 to wound in melee. Again, that one works well on a winged Hive Tyrant. The Horrors may be okay for a leadership debuff. And I feel that the Leviathan Psychic Power Hive Nexus is also pretty standout as well, giving you a Synaptic Imperative on a unit, say could be farming out an invul save to units even out of the turn. As I said, I think most lists will have the majority of these in play, and it's more of a question as to where you're using them more than if. Adaptive Physiologies are the Tyranid's points cost upgrade. These also seem like quite a nice boost. There's quite a few different options that you can just add on to any monster that's not a character, and perhaps these 3 are some of the best. For 25 points there's Dermic Symbiosis, a 4+ invul save on your big critter. That one can be quite nice on Harpies winging around, gives them a lot more extra defense on their 3+ save. Another almost no-brainer type one is Voracious Ammunition. That's 15 points for a 2+ chance to deal D3 mortal wounds on a target that you've shot. That one just seems to be one that you're almost guaranteed to get your investment back on. If you can manage to have your beastie shooting at least twice per game, that's probably going to be about 4 mortal wounds. That's basically going to kill more than 15 points of just about anything in the game. Quite a nice one to throw onto a Harpy again, or maybe an Exocrine or Tyrannifex or something. Then for just 10 points you can make a creature into a Synapse creature for 10 points. That one can be pretty usable in most Hive Fleets, but really it's a kind of standout pick for Leviathan, as their Synapse creatures get their transhuman physiology type rule. It means they can only be wounded on 4+. Again, pretty solid on most Leviathan monsters, again seems to be most commonly run on the excellent Harpies. Moving on, quite a few of the Tyranid stratagems are pretty nice as well. There's a fair few that are kind of specific to certain units, but here are perhaps a few of the most interesting ones for more generic units that quite a lot of models in the army can use. Overrun I think is a particularly handy positioning one. It basically means that if you've charged something and killed it, then you get to do a normal move again. That could be handy enough on a fair few units, say if you needed to kill something and then jump onto an objective to stop your opponent scoring it perhaps. But perhaps even more powerfully is you could use that with the Winged Hive Tyrant, swoop it out with the Reaper of Obliterax, kill something dead, and then use that massive 17-inch move with Adrenal Glands to jump it back to safety behind some Tyrant Guard. There's multiple decent options for amping up melee, particularly for monsters. You can have 1 CP for reroll wound rolls, and often there's going to be a lot of targets that that'll be quite efficient against. Say if you got something with a 3 damage or D3+3 damage attack fighting a knight or something, then reroll wounds could be a very easy value. There's also 1 CP for Adrenal Surge. That one's pretty handy for monsters getting D3 attacks, particularly Mr. Reaper Obliterax Hive Tyrants, though it could be good on Tyranid Warriors as well. And there's 1 CP for Trampling Charge, a decent chance of a bunch of mortal wounds, particularly with something that's got Horned Chitin like a Maliceptor or a Walking Hive Tyrant on foot. Otherwise there's 1 CP one for the Transhuman Roar for a monster for a turn, always a nice damage debuff if you think it might make the difference between the thing living or dying this turn. And you can also regenerate models by D3 wounds for a command point. If you've got a model that's bracketed and it's close to its next bracket, that one could be good for the extra health regained, plus also the extra damage that you'll get to do this turn. Secondaries wise, they're maybe one of the weakest sections of the book in my opinion. For the most part I think Tyranids players are going to be generally better off with going with the standard book ones from Nephilim, rather than their faction unique ones most of the time. Things like raising banners or retrieving data shouldn't usually be too hard with gargoyles winging about. Psychic Interrogation or the other Warcraft ones can be pretty nice when you've got such reliable casters, maybe combined with Engage on all fronts, or perhaps one of the kill ones to take out enemy units if targets present themselves. Out of the Tyranids ones, I think maybe one of the more usable is Cranial Feasting. This one's one where you want to try and kill the enemy Warlord and lots of characters. In general, it's a bit of an interesting one as you are likely to earn less victory points with this than Assassinate, but you might farm up a bunch of command points over the game, which might just help you out in other ways. Still though, even if the enemy had tons of characters, I might still be more tempted to take Assassinate over this. Moving on, we've got the Hive Fleets. The way that they work is that you get a core benefit from each one, and then you've got the option to take their second benefit or swap it out from 2 of 3 different tables. You also get a Warlord trait, Relic, Stratagem and Psychic Power as well. This was one of the ways that Games Workshop nerfed the faction a bit. You can no longer pick that second trait reactively like you were able to by seeing your opponent's army then changing it. You now have to record it on your army list, so you basically are committing to the extra buff pre-game. Out of all the Hive Fleets, it does seem to be Hive Fleet Leviathan that's the best overall right now. They get the full Transhuman Physiology type Roar on their Synapse units, so not being wounded on rolls of 1 to 3, and a similar but weaker ability on non-Synapse things. Wounds of 1 to 2 always fail against anything that's not Synapse, say their swarms. Overall this is a really strong trait though, particularly for things like Tyranid Warrior battle lines and all the other scary Synapse bugs that are out and about. They can then combine that with a single reroll to hit per unit's attacks, which is rarely a very bad choice to be honest, and then they can swap things out from Feed or Hunt. Perhaps 2 of the other popular picks being an army-wide +1 to charge, always great for melee, and one called an Unstoppable Swarm, ignoring modifiers to move, advance or charge. Overall, I think any of those can be decent choices depending on exactly what units you're running. On top of that, Leviathan Psychers also all know the Hive Nexus Psychic Power. This one allows them to get a different synaptic imperative on 1 core unit each turn. This could be quite nice to give, say, 1 big block of warriors a 5+ invul save for multiple turns in a row. That's quite meaningful when they only have a 4+ save. Or say boost certain units' combat, shooting or psychic abilities for multiple turns. Overall, Leviathan does seem to be by far the most played competitively, just adding loads of raw defense plus the Hive Nexus thing generally seems to be the best pick. Otherwise though, I think that the next 3 strongest choices are perhaps Kraken, Behemoth and Jormungandr. All of those are pretty interesting in their own way. Kraken gets extra AP on melee across the board, very nice for combat armies, extra advances with D3+3, and a stratagem to make them all the way up to 8-inch advances, which is just awesome in terms of threat range when you include Onslaught as the psychic power. You could potentially have Tyranid warriors moving 14 inches then charge, or even further with certain other buffs like the Turvigon Synaptic Imperative. They also have a command point farming Warlord trait as well, which is rarely the worst pick when you're a bit CP strapped in Nephilim. Otherwise, Behemoth's all about the raw melee might, +1 strength on the first round of melee, and you get to reroll charges, or you can swap out for lurk powers. The +1 strength is pretty meaningful on quite a lot of units, particularly things like, say, Gene Stealers getting to strength 5, or perhaps certain flavours of Carnifex getting them to strength 8. They've also got a +1 to wound spell to really double down on the melee hurt, plus a fight and death stratagem if the enemy tries to wipe out their warriors, for example. The other one that seems to be run at least fairly often competitively is Jormungandr. This one gives them dense cover at range either 12 inches or 18 inches, so -1 to hit across the board. They probably want to swap their second bit for something from Lurk, to be honest. And then they've got a couple of other fun things, including a 1 command point stratagem to deep strike things, so you could have loads of pop-up threats like Zoanthropes or Tyranid warriors coming from reserve maybe. And they've got a psychic power that makes their melee an extra AP -1 better, might be quite handy against certain things like Armour of Contempt Terminators. Otherwise, I feel like the other three are maybe just a little bit eclipsed by the rest. Kronos is the one that you want to run for shooting nids, if that becomes perhaps the best thing to run. They have a bit of extra range, a bit of extra AP when they're within half range, a +1 strength to their gun's psychic power, and an extra couple of anti-psyker options. They're really not that bad though if you do want to go very heavy on the guns. Otherwise, Hydra and Gorgon tend to be more about the little guys. They both seem to be mainly focused around things like Hormagaunts, swarms of melee nids outnumbering the foe. Hydra gets +1 to hit if you outnumber them, and you get reroll to wound rolls against outnumbered foes for 1 CP as well, and some slightly faster moving and consolidating. Gorgon basically gets some toxin things, where 4+ to wound always works, a power for mortal wounds in melee, and a toxin sack stratagem as well. I feel that really for both of these to be particularly good though, they kind of need melee swarms to be decent. And unfortunately, while they have their uses, mass Hormagaunts just doesn't seem to be the way that Tyranid lists are being played at the moment, so these Hive Fleets are a bit less optimal picks as a result. Overall though, Hive Fleets wise, Leviathan is pretty much the standard issue one, go that if you're unsure. Otherwise, if you want to play with excess speed, then maybe go Kraken. If you just want brutal melee damage, then it's Behemoth. And if you want to play sneaky Spec Ops Tyranids popping up from nowhere and being hard to hit, then Jormungandr is another fun option. Moving on, let's talk about the multiple and marvellous xenomorphologies of the Tyranids, and touch briefly on each unit in the Codex. First up, we've got the Tyranid Warriors, a very competitive unit right now, and perhaps one of the standout choices in the troop section. It seems to be pretty common for most lists to be running a decent amount of these. In general, the preferred loadout seems to be Bone Swords for the melee and Death Spitters for range, and then if you are building them into big squads, then things like the Adrenal Glands and the Flesh Hooks seem like reasonable upgrades, and maybe even a few Venom Cannons to help them deal with armour a bit. They just seem to be a unit that you can't really go too far wrong with as a tough battle line. The bioweapons can spit out a decent amount of range damage to the extent where they can't really be ignored, and big blocks of them with Bone Swords are pretty intimidating. They do have an awful lot of mid-strength damage to attacks. Otherwise in the troop section, all three of the flavours of Swarm do seem to be usable, but maybe not generally spammed to the extent where you have entire armies of them. For the points, Gargoyles do seem pretty handy for jumping around doing objectives. Objective secured units that move 12 inches in the first place is pretty handy, plus they have that stratagem where they can fly off the board for 1 CP, and then deep strike somewhere else to maybe do actions or threaten far-flung objectives. Otherwise, Hormagaunts are interesting as another fast-moving objective secured unit. They've got a little bit of melee, though aren't really effective against anything much besides light infantry. A fair few buffs and things within the Codex do help them out, but they tend to be quite weak if they don't have any buffs layered on them. Finally, there's Termagants as the relatively cheap chaff unit, but 7 points a model with the Strength 5 AP1 Flesh Borers. I feel that these guys are probably just about a point overcosted really. Not too bad for sitting around doing grunt work on objectives. You could maybe justify bigger units of them if you had a Turvagon around. That way they can get a decent boost to their damage, plus shield the Turvagon from harm. Otherwise, taking a look at other infantry and squads in the Codex, perhaps these are some of the other strongest, with Hive Tyrants now being a lot more important to protect to keep the synaptic imperatives on the table. Tyrant Guards seem perhaps even more important than ever. They're generally pretty tough and have at least some melee threat themselves as well. I think I'd generally be tempted by small units of 3 of them just for guard duties, and to stop the biggest and most important bugs being directly shot. Venom Thropes are fairly cheap to include a small unit of 3, they make nearby units -1 to hit so it can give them a bit of cover as they're moving up. Plus once they do get in combat they pack a little bit of melee threat themselves, particularly to light infantry, and have the chance to stop enemy units from falling back, which can be quite handy too. Again, I'd likely be tempted by a single small unit of them rather than taking loads. Zoanthropes again seem to be a good unit to have a small amount of. With their own version of Smite they can cast that very reliably, often get lucky and hit the Super Smite, plus get extra mortal wounds for each model in the squad. They can be quite good at just hoovering in a whole bunch of mortal wounds into whatever most needs to die. They're quite tough as well, and perhaps most importantly they give you access to that Invul Save Synaptic Imperative, so again I feel like most lists will probably want one small squad of these guys. Raveners feel like a bit of an alternative to Tyranid Warriors, also very efficient and a little bit faster and tougher with wounds. I think in general their stat line probably tends to beat out the Warriors, but only by a tiny amount, and they do have a fair few downsides as well, such as not being synapse and not being troops with objective secures. So in general I would probably rate Warriors very slightly higher, but I think they're still very usable. Finally, a unit that seems to be seeing a lot more play at the moment are Biovores. A small unit seems like a pretty reasonable thing to hold down a home field objective with, and contribute a bit to the battle by farming out a few mortal wounds or spore mines into annoying places, and they can near guarantee at least a little bit of pinpoint damage when you need it, really good for finishing off injured units. Otherwise, I'd say the other squads are maybe just a little bit less standout than these top sets, though again, pretty much all of them can be used in the right force. Gene Stealers are maybe a bit pricey now, but they do pay a premium for their forward deployment. They can threaten turn 1 charges and screen out sections of the board. Lictors and the character version Death Leaper pay a premium for their pop-up deep strike threat. Death Leaper was pretty spectacular before his points went up. Now he doesn't seem to be commonly taken anywhere near as much, but can also use that Warlord trait for objective secured and counts as 5 models. Now he's upwards of 100 points though. I think he's a bit harder to justify, maybe compared with the Parasite. Pyrovores really were a crazy standout unit for the Codex when it dropped, then they went up really quite a big points cost change relatively. They're 40 points now and are still quite good against infantry, though their damage output just maybe isn't super general purpose if they happen to be fighting heavy vehicles or tanks. Spore mines and mucilid spores just seem hideously expensive to actually buy them in as models. You're far better off to take something like Biophores, Spore Assist or Harpies or something that can spawn them in rather than having to pay points for them. Hiveguard went from perhaps being one of the most brutal units in the Codex to fear to being fairly tame, okay fire support and reasonably decent durability, but just not very standout compared with other gun support such as Exocrines, and even Biovores seem to be outcompeting them in terms of artillery now. And finally, Ripper Swarms are cheap chaff swarms that you can put onto objectives and things. Not getting OBSEC or being in the troop section makes them a lot more easy to overlook though I think. They don't really do a fat lot damage wise. Moving on to the bigger NIDs now, with the various flavours of monsters. I feel that in the monster pecking order, the Hive Tyrants are certainly up there, but for non-character monsters, maybe the Harpy and the Exocrine are standout choices, both of which are solidly efficient for the damage that they do. The Harpy was a unit that I thought got away kind of lightly with the Tyranids nerfs, perhaps one of the most undercosted flies in the game. It went up by a bit, but not loads, and remains kind of brutally efficient all round. Very fast, of course, decent general purpose firepower, either with the heavy venom cannons or the Stranglethorn cannons, both of which seem to be pretty viable options now the points went up on the heavy venom cannons. A few anti-infantry shots, the options to either bomb something or spawn some spore mines, and even the option to drop into melee if you need to. They seem like very good choices for Dermic Symbiosis or the Synapse upgrade for the Leviathan, and they crop up quite a lot in competitive lists. The Exocrines may be a bit more simple, just seems to be perhaps the most efficient dedicated gun bug. Decent AP firepower with a bunch of strength 3 attacks, plus fairly durable to take out with its 2+ armour. Otherwise, for slightly more interesting choices, there's Carnifexes, fairly solid flexible generalists with the core keywords, so access a few more buffs. I think perhaps the most interesting builds are the ones with the heavy venom cannons plus melee, or perhaps the Screamer Killer variant, which has a little bit of range and a whole load of attacks. The Auspex is a simple enough melee mauler, works well enough, but maybe if you're thinking about a bug to rush up and hit the enemy hard, then Hive Tyrants might do that better. And the Tyrannofex is an okay gun platform, really quite tough with the 2+ armour. It's got decent anti-tank damage with the Rupture Cannon, which can be a big threat to things like super heavies, and the Acid Spray can make it a bit more general purpose anti-infantry as it stomps up the board. It doesn't really seem to be taken all that much competitively though, Exocrines seem to win out for the same role. The Maleceptor I do think is pretty usable as well. It went up an extraordinary amount of points, up to 220 points, due to it being a mortal wound factory when the Codex first came out. Even at this massively inflated points cost though, I still think that it's usable. Being able to reliably hoover out something like 10 odd mortal wounds at close range really is no joke at all. But now you're paying far more of a premium for the privilege, and it can be a bit annoying to get in range, and far more painful if you lose it. Otherwise, I think the Tyrannosites are still interesting. It delivers a unit, then is a floating annoying threat for the opponent to deal with as well. The Spore Assist is okay to set up in the midfield provided you can as a fortification. It's got okay toughness, a little shooting, and some spore mines seeded. The Hive Clone still feels flatly inferior to the Harpy, even at the higher points cost. The Toxicrine has a few interesting tricks, but maybe just not very general purpose melee, and it's not always going to have the option of whether or not it attacks infantry or heavy things. The Trigon and Morlock are burrowing monster threats that can have a lot of attacks against infantry. Fairly annoying and reasonably cheap threats for what they do. I feel they're both very usable, but not enormously standout perhaps. And finally, the Tyranids do have a moderate sized forward world range. Maybe out of these ones, the most interesting are the Harridan as an enormous flying threat of death, the Dimacaron as a fast generalist with a whole bunch of melee, and both the barbed and the scythed hierodules both are pretty tough as they stomp up the board and pack some dangerous weapons. In general though, I would say that the Forge World choices just aren't really stand out compared with the standard Codex ones. Since the Codex dropped with all the inflated stat lines, I feel that the Forge World monsters are looking a little bit less good by comparison. Lastly, for Tyranid units, we get into the characters. I think the HQ section has got some pretty interesting picks throughout it, to be honest, though probably the two standout datasheets for me are the Winged Hive Tyrant and the Neurothrope. Both of those seem to turn up in more competitive lists than they don't. The Winged Hive Tyrant is typically sweeping around with that scary Reaper of Obliterax, give his adrenal glands for a 17-inch move, use the 1 CP stratagem for a couple of extra attacks, and you're likely going to be hammering out a whole ton of mortal wounds, never mind the actual damage that it gets, which also ignores feel no pains and damage caps. Really efficient on something that moves so quickly, plus has a couple of psychic powers and command abilities thrown in. You could also consider maybe a Shard Gullet shooting build as well, with that scary Relic Venom cannon. Otherwise, the Neurothrope is another very popular one to have around. The Tyranid psychic powers are pretty excellent, and this guy gets them as efficiently as possible with 2 casts on 1 cheap Psyker. On top of that, it can cast them incredibly reliably with that great command phase ability it has, cast on 3d6 and drop the lowest, and with that good psychic casting ability, it does seem quite common for this one to have the Synaptic Tendrils Warlord trait, maybe farming out that buff to other casters like Zonethropes or even a Maliceptor. It's fairly tough as well, and is also quite a nice place for the Resonance Shard, giving it more options and another +1 to cast. Otherwise, lots of other characters remain really usable. The Broodlord is a pretty reasonable generalist that can forward deploy. It's fairly fast and fairly good in melee, gets a psychic power, amps up 1 unit's melee, and also has a rather nice synaptic imperative that can put all your infantry in light cover for a turn, seeming like a good one if you are running a lot of warriors or something. The Parasite of Mortrex in the fast attack slot is also very useful. He moves super fast at 16 inches, so it's quite a nice one for bullying outlying enemy infantry units, spawning rippers onto objectives, and potentially just being a nuisance and flipping objectives and things, having a Warlord trait for the Obsec and the 5 models. The Turvigon does seem to be seeing a little bit of competitive play since the Tyranid changes came into effect. If you're going to try and make mass termagants work, then this one's near mandatory, I think. It makes 1 unit +1 to hit, can restore injured models to a big termagant squad, as well as spawning a new one, and it does pack a little bit of shooting, psychic, and melee as well, sitting at the heart of the swarm. The extra 2-inch movement imperative isn't bad either, that could be quite meaningful in the early game. Both the Hive Tyrant and Foot and the Swarm Lord are both interesting. I'd say probably I prefer the Foot Tyrant over the Swarm Lord myself. I think probably having the Heavy Venom Cannon plus Bone Sword is quite a nice combo. Potentially they can be quite a nice Foot Tyrant, maybe while the winged one with the Reaper goes off to fight the enemy, though you would have to take 2 different detachments to make that work. Still though, another all-round efficient unit. It does add extra durability, extra range damage, while also being cheaper than the winged one. Finally, another interesting choice is the Tyranid Prime, who can be slot free with warriors. He's got an okay combat stat line himself, and can make 1 unit reroll wound rolls of 1 as well. I think perhaps he's most interesting though for the synaptic imperative that he brings. A turn of exploding 6s to hit with shooting could be quite good on certain units. In general, I'd say maybe the most overshadowed units in the HQ section are Old One-Eye and the Trigon Prime, though perhaps even these guys aren't really all that far behind, it's just maybe that they have very good competition. Old One-Eye is expensive and maybe a little bit on the slow side as a melee monster, but if he does catches any heavy hitters in his claws, he is going to hit like an absolute truck. And the Trigon Prime is an interesting blend of regular Trigon plus Synapse. It does get an awful lot of attacks, and could be kind of interesting with that More Claws relic to allow it to reroll wounds. In general though, people do seem to prefer the Hive Tyrants over the Trigon. So with the look through the Tyranids units done, here's just one top Leviathan list that puts a fair few of these themes into practice. This one won by Mark Morrow, who used it to take first at Broadsword Wargaming Major. The list is a Leviathan list with Unstoppable Swarm, so ignoring the penalties for move and charge, and it's all fit into a single battalion detachment with Zonethropes and Tyrant Guard being slotless. The list has 3 characters in it, a Neurothrope, Winged Hive Tyrant, and the Parasite of Mortrex. The Neurothropes are buffing 1 with Catalyst for Feel No Pain, Onslaught for Advance and Charge, and the option of the Leviathan Hive Nexus. And it does have Synaptic Tendrils, which I'm going to be guessing is making the Maliceptor cast on 3d6 drop the lowest, for more chance of triggering its extra 3 mortal wounds. There's then a Winged Hive Tyrant with Reaper of Obliterax and Adrenal Glands. This one's got Psychic Scream, and it also has the Direct Guidance Warlord trait as well, the command phase buff to make 1 unit +1 to hit. Finally, the Parasite does have that Alien Cunning one, very fast moving and can do objective things, plus maybe making some rippers if it's lucky. Then in the heart of the list we have 2 big units of 9 warriors, each armed with death spitters and bone swords, and 3 of which take heavy venom cannons, and they both take flesh hooks and adrenal glands for the unit. Very intimidating and annoying blocks to shift, pretty solid damage both at range and in combat. They'll all have the effective transhuman physiology rule from Leviathan's synapse creatures, plus maybe could be a good target for Catalyst or the psychic power to give them the 5+ invul. Beyond that, for infantry there's a 10-man unit of gargoyles for fast objective taking, a unit of venom thropes that I'm going to be guessing will be trying to put the -1 to hit on the warriors, 2 biovores who could happily sit on a home field objective and manufacture some spore mines or mortal wounds, 3 tyrant guards to try and keep that hive tyrant safe, maybe have him jump out, kill something and then overrun back to them, and 3 units of zoanthropes to allow the synaptic imperative, plus belt out a bunch of mortal wounds. They also have neuroparasite and hive nexus if they don't want to be casting smite. Finally, there's a damage dealer harpy with the heavy venom cannons, a very effective and dangerous flyer with some bombs, plus it also has voracious ammunition, so one unit that it targets can ping some mortal wounds into. Finally, we also have a Maliceptor as well. This one will likely be having the 3d6 drop the lowest from the Neurothrope to allow it to trigger that 7 to cast extra mortal wounds very easily. It's got Paroxysm and Psychic Scream, a little more mortal wounds and a debuff. Again, might be a good candidate for just casting Smite on, I suppose. Overall, I feel like this one's really quite a nice balanced list with a lot of different units used. It looks like it does pretty nicely, showing off a lot of the tricks that the Tyranids have to offer, while not getting too spammy in any one thing, and all round being generally strong with Leviathan. There's a lot of units here that are just going to be able to slog up into the middle of the board, and the enemy really doesn't want to get too close to unless it wants to take a whole bunch of damage, either with melee shooting, and particularly a whole ton of psychic mortal wounds. So with one strong list out the way, I think we'll leave that there for Codex Tyranids. Hopefully the video has been somewhat of a useful guide to getting an effective swarm on the tabletop. As always, let me know your thoughts on any other tips and tricks for playing the faction. I look forward to having a read over the comments. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k stuff coming. I do tend to post new videos just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that down in the video description below. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and also automatic entry into the prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, an absolutely massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.